major leagues. And then I think people just sort of said, hey, wait a minute. And I think a lot of people just sort of had aha moments. And I think the book and all the great researchers I had and historians, the things we're able to do in that book and other things, people just sort of had that moment and said, hey, this is, they were major leagues and we got to get moving on this and recognize them and start incorporating their stats. And hopefully that the next step will be getting more black players, new league players into the Hall of Fame. I think that's the one thing we still working on.
Mm-hmm. And there's a number that there's efforts being made. Rap Dixon, John Donaldson, several others.
Yeah.
I mean, a number of others that should be,
Yeah.
could be. So it's funny you said that about aha moment because I had one this morning. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of talking and talking to a lot of people, and I'm really, really glad that there's, the number has grown. I mean, when I first started this, I mean, if I had, 10 viewers and I had in total maybe 40, 50 views, now between all the places I'm posting it, I'm up to several hundred, if not approaching 1,000 or more views.
Wow.
And there's more people that are watching it, and like I said, I post it. It's on here, but it's also on several other places that I put it as well, and it's on YouTube. It's on other forums. So I'm glad that people are there, and I'm glad that the context and the backstory of all of the people who've been doing this work for such a long time, like yourself, and I've had on, as you know, Larry Lester, James Brunson, Phil S. Dixon, Rich Purser was just on the other night, Leslie Hafey. There's many, not as many as there should be, but there's many, and like you said, there's this has been an effort that people have kept alive and been doing this for a long time. Some for good chunk of their lives, like in the case of some of these researchers and authors going back to the 70s, 80s, even before.
Yeah,
And,
John Holloway has been doing it for such a long time.
but the visibility was never raised, to this level as it has been in the last couple of years, and it's good to see. But it's funny you said that about the aha moment because I got up this morning and I thought, boy, the forest and the tree, analogy has always been something that people use a lot of times, and I think people are missing the forest for the trees here. Before we got on here, we talked about this for just a minute, but before 1901, there was no Major League Baseball as we know it. There was the National League, and that was it.
Yeah.
And then along comes the American League, which at that time was considered an upstart league. And the history of the American League goes back to the American Association in the 1890s. So now they are now a major league. They begin playing a World Series, and until 1997, they didn't play each other in the regular season at all. The only time they played each other was in the World Series, maybe some spring training games, some barnstorming, as we talked about.
Yeah, those city series, they'd have those. They'd play. But yeah.
But until 1997, was anybody saying that the American League statistics should not have been included with the National League statistics? That would mean Babe Ruth, all his home runs, other than a few for the Boston Braves, would not be included. So this forest and trees thing here all comes down to, do you want to recognize, and I don't mean you, I mean people, want to recognize the fact that there was as much talent or capable talent playing in the Negro Leagues for many, many decades prior to integration. Do you want to recognize that or not? And I think for a lot of people, it's going to come down to they don't want to for whatever reason, and they'll always come back with some pushback. And that's the way it is. But I mean,
the book, we can destroy the pushback.
So let's talk about it, right? So the Negro Leagues are major leagues, and we've talked about some of this in the past. But what's the context? How you have a number of games that they played versus each other in barnstorming or other exhibition games. What can you tell us about those?
Well, they played nearly 500 games against each other.
That we know of, right?
That we know, yeah, that's the thing. So That's another thing because oftentimes if the Negro Leaguers won, they'd be suppressed. I mean, they wouldn't report it. That happened a lot. There's a lot of games we think we know they played. We
Mm-hmm.
can't find them, but we've dug up a lot of them. And also, the Negro Leaguers started doing very well in the early 20s. And Commissioner Landis came in and said, you got to stop playing these guys as you can't, the Cardinals can't play the St. Louis Giants anymore. It's got to be all stars. And he went so far as I mean, it's we recount in the book. It's very comical in a way. They would make up a rule, and then the Negro Leaguers would keep beating them, and then they make up another rule. Well, now you can't do this, and now you can't do that, and they came up with, well, now only 3 players from a team can appear. No longer can a whole team play Negro Leaguers. Only 3 guys from a team, and it's got to be after the World Series, and no more than the certain number can play. And so they tried to ban it every time they could, but it was just the money was too good for major leaguers to
Mm-hmm.
pass up.
But
And so
yet, but yet,
the,
what's funny about what you just said, right? But yet, I just had on Rich Purser the other night.
yeah,
There's a July barnstorming game between Metuchen, New Jersey, a semi-pro team, playing the
yeah,
St. Louis Cardinals with Dizzy Dean and that entire
yeah,
roster. That was
yeah.
okay though, right?
That's okay. Well, it's okay for a couple reasons. I mean, number one, Metuchen, might have been pretty good, but they're not going to beat the Cardinals.
Hmm.
So that's not going to happen. But if the St. Louis Giants are going to beat the Cardinals, and they did beat the Cardinals, and so that's really embarrassing. If you're supposed to be the best league on the planet and you're losing to these guys, what's going on? So it's really bad. It's bad for the brand. It's bad for their image. So they had to say no more. You can't do it anymore. But even so, if you add up everything, the major leaguers won about, from what I've been able to tell, there's different tallies. They have about 53% of the time. And I just found another game the other day. It was down in Macon, Georgia, kind of a spring training game, but it wasn't reported. Except by a rival city reported it because they thought it was kind of funny. But Macon beat the Red Sox, 1903, the first year
Hmm.
the Red Sox would go on to win the World Series, but they took on this great Macon team and they lost.
Hmm.
And so and I have not been able to find a box score, but I have an account from Savannah who brought it up and said, hey, this happened. So, and not a black paper, a white mainstream press paper reported it. So these things keep coming up. They wouldn't report it. I'm sure it wasn't reported back in Boston
Hmm.
that this happened. It would have been called a practice game or an exhibition because when you lose and it's an exhibition,
Hmm. Yeah, you take your ball and you go home, right? I mean, that's.
you 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 take your ball, you go home, and you don't tell anybody about it if
Hmm.
you can avoid it.
I
If they would have beat them, boy, you sure would have had a story and a box score and how funny this is.
I
Um,
have I'm just an amateur at this, and I just kind of poke around here or there on newspapers.com or wherever I can find. But you can go on there and find the most fascinating accounts of games, and depending on the perspective of who wrote it and why they wrote it, you're going to
yeah,
find two totally different accounts for the same game.
yeah,
You may see the final score that way, but like you pointed out, I mean, maybe they downplay it. Maybe they highlight it. It depends on what really happened there. One of the
yeah.
ones that really sticks in my mind was one where Lefty Grove got beat around one time by I can't remember what team it was, but by a Negro League team.
Probably the Black
And
Sox, Baltimore Black Sox.
yeah, and there was, I mean, he actually went out of his way to make sure that there was no reporting of that in a newspaper in a negative light on him.
Yeah, he
So
was.
yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and people really need to wrap their heads around all that.
Yeah, I think later in his life he was asked point blank, "Did you play a black team?" And he said no.
Hmm.
And I think people asked him, well, polite enough not to bring up the box score and show him his name there because he did it
Yes,
more than one occasion, and he got his head beat in. So it's
yes.
maybe he forgot. It's possible, but he's pretty adamant that it never happened.
So one of the other things I found interesting that I mentioned to you, besides the dynamic that the American League National League didn't even play each other themselves for 90 years plus,
Yeah.
between 1901 and 1997 before interleague, other than the World Series and some exhibition. But that was okay. The other thing I find interesting is many of the records that are held and are sacred to many people. I mean, are held by players who were playing in a whole entirely different era themselves. I mean, one of the things I find interesting when I talk to people is many people don't have a knowledge of the way the game has evolved, and all things do. I mean, you take anything, business, sports, politics, things evolve over time, right?
Yeah.
Um, but baseball, being when it was played back in the 1860s, and I had on Andrew Nelson, who plays vintage baseball, that was underhand and no
Underhand. Yeah.
mound and no gloves, and it was a whole different game back
And
then.
you could call for high pitch or low pitch at some point.
Yes,
So
and the
high
count
low.
was you got 9 balls and 7 strikes, and it's crazy stuff, right?
Yeah.
And all
Well,
that changed over time.
1887 walks are counted as base hits. So
Some
you
some seasons, yes, you
have all
know,
these different things.
and so, but yet some of those records that go back to the beginning of time, is there any wonder why a pitcher could pitch 500 innings in a season? Well,
Yeah.
yeah, because he wasn't throwing very hard. He certainly wasn't throwing the number of pitches. I mean, today all the talk is about velocity and spin rate and all these other kind of things. There wasn't even in anybody's head back then. But yet those records are okay, and it was a whole different game back then. And I don't understand why some things are okay, some things are not. And it all comes down to, do you recognize the Negro Leagues or not? And I guess for some people they're never going to. It doesn't really matter. So let's talk about the number one thing that I get pushback on: record keeping. So can you
Uh,
tell us a little bit about what was going on in that regard? Because I can go on right now and I could show you, and I have shown people through the 20s into the 30s. The Depression was tough on a lot of things, but um,
yeah.
there are some great accounts of, I mean, literally play-by-play and box scores and standings of Negro League games. So what do you think with the record keeping in general, though? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it is what it is, and they have it. They didn't have, for the most part, near the end. They had the How group, How Bureau, from the mid '40s on started taking official statistics. I don't know where those are. You'd wait to find them. I mean, maybe Elias has them. I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
but there are. They had official statistics for many years. I think Baseball Reference and Seam Heads, and Gary Ashwell's great site. I don't think they're using those stats. They just use things that are backed up by box scores. But
Mm-hmm.
there were so many box scores. I mean, they have pretty close to, it's 90 plus percent of the box scores in the 20s, close to 100% of known games. Uh, the 30s, it gets a little, it's hard because of the Depression, so it's a little less. But it picks up in the 40s, and I think Gary's written that they have like 75% of Negro League games they have
Mm-hmm.
the stats for. So they have a lot of the games. Now, I think Larry Lester wrote in the book, and he's written on Baseball Reference. The things that they don't have. There are some anomalies that they don't have. You have to have some algorithms for some things, but they have a lot of statistics. But they are what they are, and Major League stats are not sacrosanct either.
Mm-hmm.
They go back. They give people lost hits have gained hits, lost RBIs, gained RBIs. Babe Ruth's number. Who knows how many home runs he hit? I mean, somebody probably does. I mean, ground rule doubles and walk-off home runs. Those sorts of things
Mm-hmm.
occur to me. So numbers they're not set in stone, or they kind of change and evolve. And they had pretty good record keeping. They had the Black Press, and they had several weeklies that did a good
Mm-hmm.
job recording. And I think the secret people don't realize is that mainstream presses were reporting on these games. It was news. If 4,000 people go to watch a game, they're gonna report it.
Mm-hmm.
Not always a box score, but many New York papers, Philadelphia papers, even St. Louis papers, even the press in the South, the Birmingham News is reporting on Blackburn games. They're recording Birmingham Giants games. So it's sort of white. Well, there was a kind of forgetting that went on there at some point, but they have those box scores. They have those stats. They don't have everything, pretty much due to finances and the whims of different papers, but they have a lot of the stats are there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's I think it's a push. It's kind of silly to point at you're missing this, you're missing that.
Mm-hmm.
When you can go back in even in the 90s, the Sporting News would get different box score reports for games.
Mm-hmm. It's
So
interesting, the Sporting News, you brought that up, because
yeah,
that's been another thing that's come up. I mean, so so there's the Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who you already mentioned, was in the middle of all this back in the 20s, right?
yeah,
His name was on the MVP award.
yeah,
Now it's not. And there's an effort to put Josh Gibson on there. There's
mm-hmm.
also Branch Rickey, Frank Robinson being considered. Um, Sporting News, the Spink Award for the Baseball Writers
Yeah,
Association. And what do you come to find out? That for decades, and this is not, there's no conjecture here, this is fact. For decades, the Sporting News, who was the Bible of sport and baseball coverage, especially going back into the, early, the golden age type of coverage, there were efforts to not cover black baseball and Negro League players, and even Jackie Robinson when he came
yeah,
into the league. So you have that dynamic going on that anything that is happening, who's got the keys to the kingdom there, and
well, I mean that's a great point, and it's just not ignoring it. It's just actively trying not to. Aware of this league that's doing really well against you, and trying to downplay it as much as possible. And I don't know the history of that. I should, but I mean, I think it's too bad the sporting life in Philadelphia seemed to have lost out to the Sporting News
Yes.
in St. Louis. I mean, because the sporting life would report on black games, and at least during the 19th century, and they had a much more a better approach there. The Sporting News, no, they had great teams in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they had the Giants St. Louis Giants are beating the Cardinals in the early 20s, and St. Louis Stars are beating major league teams. So
Mm-hmm.
it, it wasn't a surprise to them. They just buried as much as they possibly could. I mean, the Crawfords did play a major league team in the late 30s, and those are, I think, one of the few box scores I've ever seen from the Sporting News. And they're played in Mexico for one reason, I think, is why they actually printed those box scores.
Mm-hmm. So,
But
funny thing about that, right? Not funny, sad, really, is like take the Sporting News, for example. In 1947 and 48, when Jackie Robinson was literally coming in and changing the dynamics and changing the game of baseball, and Larry Doby followed, and then others after. There was no mention of Jackie Robinson other than he got caught in a rundown in the World Series against the Yankees or something. And it just
yeah,
is crazy to me that, wait a minute, that's what you covered? That was the picture that you
yeah,
showed? It just it doesn't make any sense, but it does give you some perspective as to, what types of things were going on, but,
but yeah, but not, but again, a lot of the press knew what was going on, and I can remember when I first started researching the St. Paul Gophers about 25 years ago or so, and one of the things that got me going on this whole thing is Minneapolis and St. Paul sports writers they had a phrase that was repeated ad nauseum since then. If only for the color of his skin, he'd be playing in the major leagues.
mm-hmm,
So the mainstream press knew, a lot of them knew. I mean, they realized this.
mm-hmm,
They
no,
So it wasn't a secret. They knew 150 years ago how good these players were.
mm-hmm,
And it just was, the hatred it's the only word you can come up with. It racism, hatred
mm-hmm,
was so strong, they just had to bury it. They couldn't admit to it.
mm-hmm. And then, like I said, they were the ones who had the keys to the kingdom, so it made it hard
Yeah,
to finally get there. And you know what? To be fair, I get it on the statistics side of things.
yeah,
Baseball, that's the beauty of baseball. Statistics are they're what they're all about. It's how you measure everybody against everybody. I get the people who are pushing back on some of that. And to be fair, one of the things that I'm seeing in regards to Baseball Reference is, for example, like Eugene Bremer is now the single season lowest ERA of all time. Lower than even Satchel Paige, lower than anybody. Tim Keefe was the prior holder going back in the 1880s. And when you look at those numbers, you go, yeah, you got to kind of go, wait a minute. He only pitched 50 some innings, first of all, which is a small sample size. And when you look at the Cincinnati Tigers team that he played for, their wins and losses don't add up. The innings pitched, the games played, nothing is adding up right now. And what I've been trying to point out though is it's an ongoing process. Things are still being updated, and this is what we have right now. How long do you wait? It's been how many generations now?
Yeah.
At some point, you have got to just say, look, they were capable. It's not like the Union Association or the Players League and some of these others that have been included, the American Association, who left and started their own leagues because of contracts or whatever it was, right? Money, whatever it was. Usually always about money. This was they simply couldn't play because they were of the color of their skin. This has nothing to do with ability here. Now the question comes down to what portion of them could have played, and you've got some analysis on that, I believe, right? What portion of players potentially could have been in Major League Baseball? That were from the Negro Leagues.
Well, we'll never know. We'll never know. But I mean, if you look at so let's take the last 50 years since 1969, since expansion, where everything more level playing field. You have about 33% players have been black, either African American or Latin American, and the numbers trending higher. It's not going down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's over 45% now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
And a lot of that is because of Asian and his Latin American players that are in baseball. But yes.
But who I know.
But they were in the Negro Leagues back in the day.
Yeah, and fewer Black Americans are playing now. But who? Mm-hmm. I mean, who started the revolution in Latin America having black players? It was the Negro Leaguers. They're the guys who.
That's a great point.
They spread the gospel. They're the ones who are going around playing. So they're the ones who started that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the fruit of this is the Latin American player in a sense.
Boy.
So anyway, you take that 33%, which is I'd say it's a low number, but let's just be nice and say
mm-hmm.
that's the number. And if you take that 33% back and you go back to 1920, you have 400 major league players, and so that's about, if you take 33% of those guys shouldn't be playing,
mm-hmm.
In the white segregated league, that's about 138 or so, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can say 60% of that league probably would still be playing if all things are equal. We'll never know,
mm-hmm.
of course.
And
you look at the Negro Leagues, and we've added it up, and they've averaged about 13 teams, or about 207 players, because their rosters are smaller,
mm-hmm.
would have been playing each year. And so you take 2/3 of those guys, and you get about 135 players, and so that's what you come up with.
Mm-hmm.
Is so each league, probably was operating, if it would have been fully integrated, about a third of each league probably would have been in the majors and high minors.